At my grandson's birthday party, my daughter slapped me, right in front of everyone, all because the boy said I was the one who taught him how to love bedtime stories. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I just walked home and reached for the envelope marked Will Revision. Some wounds stay invisible, but their silence can break everything. And what came next changed the meaning of family forever. It was just before 7 a.m. when I heard Henry's little feet pattering across the hallway. He always woke early, just like his mother used to when she was 5. I was in the kitchen stirring oatmeal, the cinnamon and brown sugar already mixed in. He climbed onto the stool by the window and looked out like it was the most sacred ritual of the day. I poured us both a bowl and handed him his favorite blue spoon, the one with the little whale at the end. He grinned and kicked his legs happily under the table. That morning, the light slanted in through the curtains in a way that made the whole kitchen feel soft. Henry told me about a dream where he flew over a library made of clouds. I listened and nodded. I told him that sounded like a place I'd love to visit someday. And I meant it. Cameron had dropped him off 2 weeks ago, saying her schedule in Philadelphia had picked up. Late meetings, long commutes. Travis was away on business too often. It would just be easier if Henry stayed with me for a while. Her voice was clipped efficient. I hadn't seen her eyes soften once during the entire drop-off. At first I was glad. I missed the hum of a child in the house. Henry's presence brought a rhythm back to my days. Story time at dusk, morning pancakes on Sundays, folding laundry while he pretended the socks were superheroes. It felt like life again. But in the quiet spaces, I noticed things. Cameron's check-ins grew shorter, just text messages, no video calls. When I called, she would let it go to voicemail and then reply with a short line hours later. Sorry, busy day. Once she did answer. It was on speaker, I think. Her voice sounded different, measured, professional, like I was someone she owed a quick courtesy call to, not her mother. She asked if I'd considered fixing up the house, said it looked a bit too old-fashioned for a child to grow up in. I smiled then, but something in me tightened. Henry, meanwhile, kept running into my arms each morning like I was the sun rising. He asked for my banana bread after dinner. He kissed my cheek and said he liked the way I sang him to sleep. And every time my heart swelled and ached all at once. Looking back now, I should have sensed it. That early, quiet warning, like a curtain slowly being drawn between me and my own daughter. I ignored it. I wanted to believe I was helping holding the family together in my small way. But something was changing. Not loudly, not all at once. Just like how fall creeps in. First a yellow leaf, then the wind grows cooler. Then one day you look around and nothing's green anymore. If you've ever held on to moments with someone else's child, knowing they might be taken back without warning, then maybe you'll understand why I held Henry so tightly that morning. And maybe you'll understand what it cost me. By the second week, Cameron's presence had become more of a shadow than a part of our days. Her calls, once daily, had turned into brief texts. Henry okay, or did he nap? No warmth, no conversation, just check-ins like she was managing a schedule, not a child. I tried to bridge the distance. I sent her photos. Henry watering the tomato plants, Henry building a pillow fort, Henry reading with his flashlight past bedtime. She rarely responded beyond a thumbs up. Once she replied with a single sentence, "He shouldn't be using flashlights like that. It's not healthy." No mention of the book he was excited about. No praise for how well he was reading, just correction. That weekend she called me through her car's Bluetooth. I could hear traffic and the clicking of her turn signal. She asked how the house was holding up and whether I'd considered modernizing the living room. She said the wallpaper made it look tired. I told her it was the same wallpaper she used to trace clouds on as a little girl. She went quiet, then changed the subject to Henry's bedtime routine. There was something in her tone I couldn't name, distant, mechanical, like she wasn't listening to my answers, just ticking boxes. I wanted to believe it was just stress. Her job, her marriage, the city life pulling her in too many directions. But it didn't feel like stress. It felt like detachment. Still, I said nothing. I kept our mornings steady, our dinners warm. Henry was thriving here. He danced when he brushed his teeth. He asked me to tell him stories about his mother as a little girl. And I did. I told him about the time Cameron dressed up as a cow for Halloween and mooed at every door. He laughed so hard he fell off the couch. But with every giggle, every hug, I felt a small fear grow, like I was holding on to something too precious, something that wasn't mine to keep. One evening, as I folded laundry in the den, I found Henry sitting quietly in the hallway, staring at a photo of Cameron holding him as a baby. I sat beside him and asked what he was thinking. He didn't answer. He just leaned his head on my shoulder. That silence stayed with me for days. I began to see the shift more clearly. Cameron wasn't just busy. She was stepping away. Not physically, but emotionally. It was like she was creating space, slowly detaching herself from the role she once embraced. The way she spoke of Henry, it felt managerial, formal, as if parenting had become an obligation rather than a connection. And the house, she mentioned it more often. The layout, the upkeep, the location. Always in passing, always with a hint that it was no longer suitable. Like she was framing a case in her mind, preparing for some decision she hadn't shared. I didn't ask. I didn't push. I just folded Henry's socks and lined up his shoes by the door. I poured his milk in the blue cup. I pretended things were still as they used to be. But deep down, I could feel the ground shifting. Not a quake, just a slow, steady drift. Enough to know that something was coming. I just didn't know how far it would go. Cameron arrived on a Friday afternoon suitcase, in hand heels clicking sharply against the walkway. She didn't knock, just opened the door with her spare key and walked in like she was inspecting a rental. Henry ran to her with his usual joy, but she barely bent to hug him. She glanced around, eyes scanning the room like she was measuring it. Her coat was designer too fitted for our weather. Her voice was clipped professional. She asked if the guest room had been dusted, if I had remembered to lower the thermostat before bedtime. She didn't ask about Henry's drawings on the fridge or the new bedtime song we'd made up. At dinner, she sat at the end of the table checking her phone between bites. Travis followed a few steps behind her all evening, barely speaking. When I asked how work was going, he shrugged and said he was taking some time off. I noticed he didn't take off his coat. Cameron made polite comments about the meal, then set her fork down and brought out a small notepad from her purse. She started asking about storage space, whether I still used the sewing nook upstairs, and if I had ever considered converting the back porch into a closed sunroom. She even pulled out her phone and began snapping pictures of the kitchen cabinets. I watched in silence, something cold settling in my chest. Henry seemed confused, clinging to my arm and whispering that he wanted to sit on my lap, like when he was smaller. Cameron glanced up and said flatly that he was getting too old for that. Then she turned to Travis and told him to take a photo of the living room window from a wider angle. After dinner, she stood in the hallway holding a tape measure. She was measuring the width of the front door. I asked if she was planning renovations. She gave a half smile and said something vague about just exploring options in case long-term arrangements needed adjusting. That night, I sat in my room, the house feeling less like a home and more like a space under review. I heard Henry talking in his sleep, the kind of soft murmuring kids do when their minds are too full. I walked into his room and stood quietly in the doorway. The moonlight touched the side of his face. He looked peaceful, but I could see the crease between his brows. Down the hall, Cameron and Travis whispered behind closed doors. Their voices were too low to make out, but I caught fragments. Phrases like outdated wiring, not enough closet space, and appraisal timing. I knew then that this wasn't just a visit. It was an assessment, an inventory, a quiet reshaping of something I had once believed unshakable. The next morning, Cameron left early, citing a meeting. Travis stayed behind to pack up their things. I offered him coffee. He declined. I asked if they were okay. He mumbled something about stress and too much change. He didn't meet my eyes. As they pulled away, Henry waved from the back seat, but his hand was slow, uncertain. I stood on the porch long after the car turned the corner, the tape measure still lying forgotten on the hallway table. I picked it up and placed it gently back into the drawer next to a photo of Cameron when she was 9, holding a sunflower twice her height. I looked at the photo and whispered not to her, but to the memory of that little girl, the one who used to believe this old house was magic. Something told me that memory was all I had left. That afternoon, after Cameron and Travis had left the house, felt unusually still. Henry had gone out to ride his bike with the neighbour's boy, and I was in the kitchen folding towels. The soft hum of the washing machine was the only sound, but something in the air felt off, like a cold draught sneaking through closed windows. I walked into the hallway, meaning to grab a sweater, when I heard Cameron's voice coming from the living room. I paused. She must have left her Bluetooth connected to the speaker. Her voice was clear, clipped, and fast, not how she usually talked to me. I stood frozen. "No, I can't keep doing this back and forth," she said. "Henry is starting to treat her like she's his real mother. Yesterday he told me she makes the best oatmeal in the world. I mean, I get it, but this is exactly the problem. He's attaching too much." There was silence on the other end. Then she added, "We need to remind him who his actual mother is. Gently but firmly. I don't want him growing up confused. She's not part of the long-term plan." I didn't move. My hand tightened around the edge of the doorway, and my breath caught in my chest. Not part of the plan. It wasn't just what she said. It was the calmness in her tone, like she had already made the decision and was just explaining logistics. I didn't confront her. I didn't rush to disconnect the call or storm out in anger. I stepped back into the kitchen, sat down slowly at the table, and reached for a pen. That was the moment I started writing everything down. Dates, events, little things I had ignored for months. I jotted down what Henry liked to eat for breakfast, what stories he asked for at bedtime, how often Cameron called or didn't call. I wrote how often Travis spoke, which was hardly ever. Every quiet detail that had once felt too small to matter suddenly gained weight. I didn't know what I would do with the notes, but I knew I had to start somewhere. I couldn't trust what came next. That night when Henry returned, I looked at him differently, not with less love, never that, but with a new kind of awareness. His hug felt tighter. He leaned his head on my shoulder longer than usual. I kissed the top of his hair and didn't say a word. Later, when he fell asleep, I opened the hallway closet. Inside, at the very back, behind the winter coats, was a small tin box that hadn't been touched since my husband passed. Inside were legal papers. Old ones, his will, the deed to the house, notes he had scribbled in the margins of our shared notebook about protecting what matters. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I simply sat on the floor with that box in my lap, turning through each paper as if I were relearning my own life. Outside, wind moved through the oak tree in our front yard, its branches casting long, thin shadows across the carpet. For years I thought being quiet was the same as being wise, that being patient meant love. But something shifted that evening. Not anger, not bitterness, something colder, sharper, a clarity. If Cameron was planning something, and it certainly sounded like she was, I had to be ready. Not with shouting, not with drama, but with calm, documented truth. That night I began keeping a second notebook, not for chores or groceries, but for memories, for evidence, for dignity. If they were going to treat me like a placeholder, I would at least make sure I disappeared on my own terms. Henry's birthday fell on a Sunday that year. I had been planning it for weeks, making lists in my head, then quietly adjusting them as I sensed Cameron pulling away, giving me fewer updates, fewer calls. I didn't ask her opinion on the cake or the colours. I just did what Henry loved. I baked the same banana cake I used to make when he was 4. I folded napkins into shapes of foxes and bears and strung up little flags around the sunroom where the light poured in brightest. Henry helped hang the balloons and even drew a crayon sign that read "Happy Birthday" with Grandma in crooked letters. That morning he ran through the house in his dinosaur pajamas, squealing full of life. I took a photo of him holding a balloon to his ear, laughing like he could hear it talk back. I saved it on my phone and printed a copy later. But that day I just watched him, quietly, carefully. Guests arrived around 2, some neighbours, 2 kids from his class, and Cameron and Travis, late of course. Cameron walked in wearing a grey silk blouse and slacks that looked like she was headed to a business meeting, not a child's party. She smiled, tight-lipped. Travis nodded politely and made a beeline for the food table. Henry ran to his mother with a handmade crown in hand. He said, "Grandma taught me how to fold this. She knows how to do everything." He meant it with joy. I could tell by the way his face lit up. But I saw the shadow pass across Cameron's eyes. Her smile dropped for just a second. She glanced over at me, sharp distant, then bent down and whispered something to Henry I couldn't hear. I didn't think much of it then. Cake time came. Everyone gathered. I lit the candles and stood back as Henry closed his eyes and made a wish. We clapped. I brought out slices on colourful plates. Cameron barely touched hers. Then came the moment. It was quiet. Henry stood beside me, holding my hand, and said clearly, "I want to live with Grandma forever." Cameron froze. Her jaw tightened. She walked straight toward us, bent down again, whispered something into Henry's ear. He looked confused. And then she stood up and slapped me. A full, clean slap across my cheek. Not hard enough to knock me back, but firm. Precise. No one moved. Travis turned, slightly raised one hand like he might speak, but said nothing. Just looked down at his feet. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I only touched my face and looked her in the eye. The silence that followed was louder than anything I had ever heard. The kids didn't understand, but the adults, they stood there, stunned. Cameron adjusted her blouse, picked up her purse, and called Henry. He didn't move at first. Then slowly he followed her out the door without looking back. The guests began to leave soon after, mumbling things like, "Thank you," or "Hope everything's okay," their faces pink with embarrassment. I stood in the same spot by the cake table. I looked at the empty chairs, the fallen balloon near the fireplace, the fox-shaped napkins, still neatly stacked. Later that evening, I washed the dishes by hand, even the plastic cups. I didn't rush. I dried each one and stacked it away like any other night. But inside, something had shifted. I added a new page to my notebook that night. Just a single line. She slapped me in front of everyone, and no one stopped her. Then I closed the book and placed it under the stack of old recipe cards. Not rage, not revenge, just memory. Because some things you write down not to remember, but to never forget. The morning after Henry's birthday felt like someone had stolen the colour from my world. The kitchen looked the same. The curtains still fluttered softly near the sink. The sunlight came in like any other day. but everything felt too still, too quiet. His dinosaur mug sat on the counter, half a sip of milk dried inside. The crown he had made for himself was crumpled beside the fruit bowl. And the balloon, the one he loved most, a green one with stars, had floated down in the middle of the night and now rested limp on the floor. There was no knock, no tiny feet rushing in, no arms flung around my waist while I stirred oatmeal. Cameron had taken Henry. I didn't even get a goodbye. I folded the napkins from the party, not because I had to, but because my hands needed something to do, the same way I washed every dish, wiped every counter, and swept the floor twice. Every gesture was a small attempt to hold on to what had already slipped away. Around noon, I opened the hallway closet and pulled down a small tin box. It was dented on one corner and smelled faintly of cedar. Inside were papers I hadn't looked at in years. Will's letters from the attorney who handled my husband's estate. A few family photos wrapped in old tissue. I sat down at the kitchen table and laid everything out. My hands didn't tremble. I was calm. Too calm, maybe. I found the will, the original one written when Henry was just a baby. I remembered the way my husband and I had debated the wording for weeks. We had agreed on everything except one thing: Cameron's level of involvement in the house. He wanted to leave it equally between her and me. I had insisted it remain in my name at least while I was alive. Looking at the yellowing paper now, I felt something shift, like someone whispering across time, reminding me of promises made and what still mattered. That evening, I didn't turn on the TV like usual. I didn't read. I just sat by the window with a blanket around my shoulders and watched the street grow dark. The house felt bigger than usual, not in space, but in silence. I thought about Henry, about how he had looked at me when he said he wanted to live with me forever, about how he hadn't even looked back when Cameron pulled him away. Maybe he wasn't allowed to. I lit a candle on the mantel, cinnamon and clove, his favorite scent. He used to say it reminded him of warm hugs. I watched the flame dance and told myself I was lighting it for peace, for clarity. But deep down, I think I lit it to mourn. That night I made a list in my head. Not a list of revenge, a list of memory. Things I had taught him: how to tie his shoes, how to say thank you with his eyes, how to bake banana muffins from scratch. Moments I would not let them erase. I folded the will back into the tin box and returned it to the closet. But this time, I placed it on a different shelf, eye level, within reach. Because for the first time in a long while, I realized this wasn't just about Henry. This was about me, and how I would protect the part of me they couldn't take. I took the bus that morning, the same route I had used when I still worked at the old public library. Familiar stops, same rusted green benches. But this time I wasn't carrying a book bag. I held the tin box wrapped inside my old church shawl. Mr. Feldman's office was on the second floor of a brick building next to the pharmacy. No elevator, just a creaking wooden staircase that carried the scent of dust and time. He hadn't changed much. His hair, whiter than mine, was combed back neatly, and he still wore those suspenders that always looked one size too tight. But his eyes were kind. They didn't rush me. I sat down. He didn't ask questions, just waited. I opened the tin box. I handed him the original will, the letters, a copy of the deed. He scanned them, silently nodded, then placed them gently on his desk. After a long moment, he leaned forward and said simply, "I see." He reached into a drawer and pulled out a legal pad. "Let's start fresh," he said. "Your words, your terms." I spoke slowly, choosing each sentence with care. I wanted to protect the house, not out of pride, but because it was the only place Henry had known safety. I asked for new clauses terms that would prevent Cameron from making any decisions without my written consent. I asked for something more too, a contingency plan in case I passed one that would bypass her altogether. Feldman didn't blink. He wrote everything down in neat block letters. I asked him if there was a way to assign stewardship of the property to a foundation or trust focused on supporting children in difficult home situations. He looked up at me then, and for the first time that morning smiled, not out of surprise, but as if he understood something deeper. We worked through lunch. When I left, my fingers ached from signing, but my heart was strangely light. Back at home, I started making lists, not of chores, not of groceries, but of memories. I wrote down everything I had done for Henry since he was born, every summer he stayed with me, every time I picked him up when Cameron's meetings ran late. The little thing, too, like sewing his name into his backpack straps or keeping a nightlight in the guest room, because he said the shadows there felt too big. I even made a list of things Cameron had said, cold phrases, quick remarks. I didn't do it for revenge, I did it to remember the full picture. Because one day, if this ever went to court, I wouldn't be telling a story, I would be presenting a history. I kept a quiet routine after that. Still cleaned, still cooked for one. But each action carried weight now, a sense of preparation. The framed photo of Cameron and Travis on the living room shelf was replaced with a small, quiet landscape painting. I didn't smash anything. I didn't tear photos. I simply re-edited the space. That week I also visited the community centre. I asked if they needed volunteers for tutoring or story hour. I signed up for both. At night I started journaling again. Not about what was lost, but about what I was reclaiming. My voice, my name on the mailbox, my right to define what family meant. No one else would write that for me. And if Henry ever came looking, I wanted him to find it clearly, calmly, unmistakably. The truth. The envelope came on a Thursday. No return address, just my name scribbled in Cameron's hurried handwriting. The mail carrier left it tucked beneath the doormat, like even he didn't want to hold it too long. I didn't open it right away. I let it sit on the kitchen table as I finished folding Henry's old pajamas, the ones with faded rocket ships he used to insist on wearing even in summer. I smoothed the sleeves before placing them back in the drawer where no one would look. When I finally opened the envelope, a $50 bill slipped out first, folded once clean and stiff. Then came the note written on the kind of thank you card you buy in packs of 10. Thanks for helping with Henry. Here's something for groceries. I read the line again. Then once more. Not a word about the birthday, not a mention of the slap. Just that. As if I were a sitter she forgot to tip. I placed the card back in the envelope, set the money on the counter. I didn't cry. I didn't pace. I simply walked into the living room and stood in front of the shelf. For years, that shelf held framed photos. Our wedding, Cameron's graduation, a snapshot of Henry at the pumpkin patch with pie on his chin. And then on the end, the photo from their wedding, a glossy 8x10 of Cameron and Travis, standing stiff in front of a vineyard, holding flutes of champagne. I had stood behind them in the original shot, but Cameron had cropped the image before framing it. I picked it up. The frame was warm from the afternoon sun. I dusted it gently with my sleeve, then opened the back, removed the photo, and slid it into a box in the hall closet. In its place, I inserted a painting one I had picked up at a church rummage sale years ago. A simple scene, hills, wildflowers, a wooden fence that led nowhere. Quiet. Untouched. I stepped back and looked at the shelf. It didn't feel angry. It felt clean. That night I made chamomile tea and lit the small beeswax candle I kept for power outages. I sat in the kitchen where the ticking clock had kept time through every stage of Cameron's life. I thought about Henry, about how he used to drag his chair beside mine and insist on dipping his cookie in my tea. I glanced at the $50 bill on the counter. It was still there in the morning. I didn't spend it. Instead, I used an envelope I had saved from Henry's last birthday invitation. I wrote Cameron's address on it, placed the bill inside, and sealed it with a blank card. No message, no signature. Just the bill folded once and sent back. A few days later, I received no reply, and I didn't expect one. Something in me had shifted. That card that money wasn't an insult. It was proof. Proof of how far she had moved from where we once stood as mother and daughter. I no longer needed to argue with her silence. I no longer needed to explain myself. I had begun clearing space, not just on the shelf, but in my life. Room for stillness, room for breath. And one small corner still lit by memory reserved for a boy who once called my lap his safe place. The call came late in the morning, just as I was rinsing the dishes from breakfast. The number on the screen showed an area code I didn't recognize, but something in my chest tightened the second it rang. The voice on the line was gentle, practiced. A woman named Angela from the elementary school's counseling department. She said Henry had been withdrawn in class. Not disruptive, just quiet. Too quiet. They had spoken with Cameron. She said he was adjusting. A lot of change. Nothing serious. But during a guided art session, the children had been asked to draw a picture of someone they felt safe with. Henry had drawn me. He told the counselor I made the oatmeal the real way, that I tucked him in like in the stories, and that when he was at his mum's place, sometimes the walls felt like they were listening. Angela paused before continuing. She said Henry mentioned something else in a whisper. He said he didn't like the way his mum looked at him when he laughed too loud. Said it felt like trouble was waiting around the corner every time he smiled. He said he missed the kitchen window at my house, where the birds came every morning and I would let him name them all. I stood at the counter, hand gripping the edge of the sink. The window in front of me was fogged from the dishwater steam, but outside I could see the bare limbs of the elm tree shifting in the wind. A gust hit the glass with a soft rattle. Angela said they weren't making any official recommendations. Not yet. They were just informing me as someone Henry clearly cared for. She thanked me and hung up. I stayed in the kitchen long after the call ended. I didn't sit down. I didn't cry. I stared at the light creeping in through the lace curtains. The candle from the other night was still on the table, its wick blackened and bent untouched. On the wall beside me was a small framed quote, something my husband had given me years ago, written in faded script. It read, "You do not speak to be heard. You speak to remember who you are." I whispered his name, not out loud, just in my chest where it still lived. That evening I made tea. No sugar, just warmth. I sat by the window and watched the shadows stretch across the yard. Cameron had sent no updates, no photos, no messages, only silence. But Henry had found a way to speak, not through words, but through drawings, through whispered memories of oatmeal and birds and the way sunlight hit the curtains in the morning. That night I pulled out the small box of his things I hadn't yet put away. Inside were a few crayon drawings, one of us holding hands with wild shapes above our heads. He said they were ideas floating. Mine were purple, his were red. I placed the picture on the fridge. Then I sat at the kitchen table. My hands rested on the wood, flat and still. The wind moved through the cracks in the window pane. It wasn't the chill that made my fingers tremble. It was knowing he remembered. He remembered everything. The week passed without a sound from Cameron. No calls, no envelope, no voice asking how I was doing. The house, though still mine, had grown quieter. It no longer echoed with Henry's footsteps or his made-up bird songs. But there was one thing I hadn't done in years. One small promise I made to myself long before everything turned heavy. At the corner of our town square stood a small library with bricks the colour of late autumn. It had ivy on one side and a flag that fluttered tiredly in the breeze. On the door was a sign handwritten in green marker seeking volunteers for story time. I stood in front of it for a few minutes, just watching. Then I walked in. The woman at the front desk was no older than Cameron, but her eyes were kind. She didn't ask for anything except my name and availability. I said I could start right away. The first time I read to the children, my hands trembled on the pages. It wasn't from fear. It was from holding something that hadn't belonged to me in a long time attention. Trust. A circle of eyes looking up at me without judgment. Just curiosity. There were 6 children that morning. One of them, a girl with missing front teeth, called me the Silver Lady. Another boy offered me his sticker sheet because I pronounced the dragon's name with real magic. Each session became easier. I started wearing my brooch again. The one shaped like a maple leaf, gold-edged, faded with time. I wore it because Henry once said it looked like a treasure. The children liked that. One morning, as I walked to the library with my cloth bag of picture books, a boy from the last session ran up to me and handed me a dandelion. It was crushed in his hand, half its seeds gone. But it was warm. The librarian brought out extra chairs the following week. She said the kids had been talking about me at home. Some even asked their parents to bring them early, just so they wouldn't miss the start. I didn't say much about myself. Just enough. They didn't need to know that my daughter no longer called, that my grandson only existed now in my memories and one crayon drawing on the fridge. All they needed to know was that I had stories, and that when I spoke, the room quieted like a secret was about to be shared. One Friday afternoon, after the last child had waved goodbye, I stayed behind to help stack the books. The sun was lower in the sky, casting long, honey-coloured shadows across the floor. And there, in that stillness, I felt something I hadn't known in years. I felt useful. Not because I was needed by a family who took me for granted, but because I was seen, heard, valued for the way my voice could carry a tale across a quiet room and plant it into the heart of a child. That evening I sat on the library steps for a while. The breeze was gentle, the sky pink at the edges. I closed my eyes, and for the first time since Henry was taken away, I breathed without tightness in my chest. I wasn't just the woman who lost her place in her daughter's life. I was a reader of stories, a silver lady with a maple brooch and a warm voice. And somehow in that small library on the edge of town, I had started to find my way back to myself. It started with a letter. A white envelope slipped into my mailbox, no return address. Just my name, printed neatly across the front. Inside was a notice from the county registrar's office. It mentioned the initiation of a transfer review for property held under my name, a phrase that stuck out like a thorn preliminary authorization for asset control pending final approval. I read it 3 times before my hands stopped shaking. I hadn't signed anything. The next morning I went to see Mr. Feldman. His office was quiet dust dancing in the light from a tall window. He read through the letter slowly, his eyebrows drawing into a low line. He didn't look surprised, only disappointed. He explained it calmly. Cameron had filed for what's called anticipated custodial transfer, a legal maneuver where a family member attempts to gain preemptive rights over assets, often under the pretense of caregiving or future planning. But it wasn't future planning. It was a silent takeover. She had filed the request 3 weeks ago, while Henry was still here, before the birthday, before the slap, before I had even thought of changing anything. Mr. Feldman leaned forward and placed a new document on the table. It was the revised version of my living trust, the one we had updated together a few weeks ago. Because of that update, Cameron's maneuver hadn't gone through yet. Her paperwork was denied for incomplete authority, he said. But if you hadn't come in that day, it might have been too late. I sat there a long time, staring at the edge of the oak table, thinking how betrayal has layers, some loud, some quiet, but all sharp. I nodded, then asked him to move forward with the next step. That afternoon, we finalized the trust. Cameron's name was removed. Every clause, every contingency that once included her gone. Instead, I named the final beneficiary not as a person, but as a foundation, the Henry Lane Foundation, a quiet fund set to provide school supplies and therapeutic support for children separated from primary caregivers, especially grandparents raising children without legal protection. It wasn't revenge. It was clarity. That night back home, I opened the drawer of my old secretary desk, took out the silver key I hadn't touched in years. It opened the bottom cabinet where I had stored my husband's journals and city council files. Tucked behind them, I found the deed to the house. I traced the faded ink with my finger. This house had held birthdays and bruises, secrets and lullabies, and now it would hold something more lasting than anger. A few days later, Mr. Feldman called to confirm everything was officially recorded. Irrevocable. Protected. I didn't cry. Not out of pride, not out of spite. Just a quiet, tired knowing. Cameron would find out in due time. Maybe she'd protest. Maybe she'd stay silent. That wasn't mine to carry anymore. That evening, I walked through the house slowly. I didn't touch the photos. I didn't move a single chair. I simply looked. And for the first time, I didn't feel like a ghost waiting to be erased. I had made my choice. On paper. In heart. And soon, in what came next. That morning, I took down the last photo. It was the one near the hallway, Henry in a yellow jacket holding a pine cone with both hands, like it was treasure. Cameron had snapped the picture during a fall picnic years ago. I had left it up the longest, not out of sentiment, but because I didn't know where to put the memory. Now it lay gently in the bottom drawer, wrapped in soft linen. The walls looked bare at first, but bare wasn't always bad. I replaced the empty hooks with hand-stitched art scenes of prairie fields and open skies. Not expensive, just quiet. In the kitchen, I scrubbed the old enamel sink until it gleamed. Then I lit the small cinnamon candle Henry used to love. It burned low and steady, releasing that faint sweetness he always said smelled like hugs. That evening, as the wind brushed past the windows, I sat by the lamp and folded the last of his little sweaters. I didn't cry. I didn't wish for what-ifs. I simply pressed each line and let the silence rest beside me. I wasn't waiting for anyone to knock. I wasn't hoping for apology. I had lived a full cycle. From the day Cameron placed Henry in my arms to the moment I signed the papers that protected this house. The arc had closed. Not with drama, not with vengeance, but with choice. The candle flickered once, then settled. And I realized I had not just given something away. I had kept something for myself. The right to remain whole. Later that night, I stood at the front window. Outside, the porch light glowed amber. It was soft, not too bright. Just enough to let someone know the house was still here. If one day Henry found his way back, he'd know the door had never been shut in anger. But until then, this light was for me. Because sometimes the bravest thing a mother can do is let go and still choose to love quietly from afar. I had lost a daughter, but somewhere between grief and clarity, I had found myself. If you've ever had to let go of someone you love in order to find peace, then you know how heavy silence can be. This was not a story of revenge, but of reclaiming dignity in the quietest way possible. If any part of this story touched you, I invite you to share your thoughts or a memory of someone who taught you strength in stillness. Your words might bring comfort to someone else who is still learning how to heal. Thank you for listening and for walking with me through this journey.